Nobody knows what's going on. Nobody knows. Nobody has the faintest idea. The best guesses are lies. You may be sure of it.
All right, James, thank you so much for doing this today.
No problem. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. I've been following your work for quite a long time, since probably 2012 is when I discovered your show. And you're one of the old school people, in my opinion, that's sort of seeking truth in a very grounded and respectable way. I really appreciate that. You don't seem to cling to any sides. You don't ever seem to be ideologically possessed. And that's a pretty hard thing to find in this world today. So I do appreciate your work and what you do. And today I'd like to just dive into some of your current perspectives and give people a little heads up on who you are, but I don't want to spend too much on your bio. There's a lot of information on your website. So for people, they need to do their own homework. They can go and do some of that and get their prerequisites done on their own time. But just give the audience a little overview of what your show is for and what it does.
Sure. Well, for people who don't know, I am James Corbett of CorbettReport.com, and I started the Corbett Report back in 2007 as an outlet to talk about news and politics and finance and economics and society and history and philosophy and science and absolutely anything and everything else that I'm interested in, precisely because at that time I was living through the media revolution that was taking place online and starting to find pieces of information that went against everything I'd ever known or been taught my entire life. And I saw the discrepancy widening between what was available in the establishment media versus what was happening online. And I decided, well, I've got to put myself out there just because I know this information is important, and I'm going to give it a try. And who could have imagined that now, nearly 20 years later, I'd be sitting here talking from my room in Japan to people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, occasionally millions of people around the world with my videos. But here we are. So that is where my work comes from. That's what motivates it. And from that perspective, I have been hoping and trying my level best, as any human being can do, to find truths that are not being said in the establishment. And I would put my track record against the CNNs and other mouthpiece establishment media over that time period, because I think it's self-evidently true, and more people are realizing that we have not been told the truth about what is happening on the geopolitical international level for a long, long time, if ever.
Right. I love that. Yeah. And since probably 2020, a lot of the general public has come to realize just how nefarious things actually are. And people are starting to really question, but they don't really have any good idea where to go or what to do with that. And for someone like you that's been diving into this stuff and that you've been chipping away at it for so long, you've been building a nice map. And it seems like even with your new book, you have a pretty good understanding of the key players involved and the track history and the way that things have played out over a long period of time. But for someone who's just waking up to some of this stuff with the Epstein files and just the nefariousness of it and just how evil it seems, what do you suggest for people to do with this information? Because I work even as a first responder and I show up to work every day, and these people are just raising kids, trying to get through their lives and, serving the community. But it's almost like it's too much for them and they're overwhelmed and they don't even want to look at it. What is your suggestion in that part?
That's a very important question, perhaps the most important question, because yes, it's great to know information, but if it doesn't actually serve any purpose in your life, what is the point of knowing it? And so what is this for? And I think you hit the nail on the head with the map analogy, because that is the way that I tend to look at the work that I'm doing. I am trying to create a map of the terrain that we are living on that is more accurate than the map that we've been given through our 10,000 hours of public indoctrination in the public indoctrination system, or what we hear on the nightly news. We've been fed a map of reality that doesn't really map onto our reality. And so I am attempting to fill in parts of that map and hopefully give people a more accurate lay of the land so that they can then calculate their own position in the actual reality they're living in and then chart their own course. Because, of course, I'm not here to tell people how to live their lives or what to do with this information. They're going to apply it in whatever way they can and whatever way they see fit, given their own life and their own goals, etc. But if you don't have an accurate map, then you're going to be wandering around and maybe you'll stumble on the place that you actually want to get to by accident. But otherwise, you'll probably end up somewhere else. So that's what I think of this as. I'm not here to tell people what their goals should be, but I'm hopefully here to help them get to that goal.
Yeah. And you, from what I've heard from you, you don't subscribe to any team anymore. I don't think you ever really did. But this whole idea of left, right, blue, red, it's all a smoke show and it's to divide us. And it seems like it's been orchestrated. And so, would you take us on a little brief history tour back to when maybe Operation Paperclip, things like that, that era of time where our institutions and our narrative has been pretty much completely hijacked to where we're all indoctrinated, just to give people the understanding that all of us, even including me, have been under some form of hypnosis or mind control experiment that's been deployed through this sophisticated technological advanced screens and memes. And so I'd just love to hear a little bit of your way of looking at that, because you've been looking at this very deeply for a long time.
Yes, yes. And I guess it's a question of how much perspective you want to have on this. You could have the very overarching perspective of civilizational history, in which there has always been a ruling class that seeks to rule over the masses. And they've always given themselves some justification that the masses have latched onto for why this ruling class deserves to exist. And of course, thousands of years ago, the pharaoh was literally God on earth. And that's why you had to do what the pharaoh said. That was, of course, modified over time as people started to become a little bit more sophisticated. They realized they needed a more sophisticated ruling class justification. So they came up with the divine right of kings, the mandate of heaven, things like this. But eventually, after post-Enlightenment and the revolutions against various monarchs and overthrowing French Revolution, etc., that idea started to crumble. And so what was cobbled together in its wake was the modern idea of representative democracy. And now there are, of course, there's people who are sitting in positions of power, but they are your elected representatives, and you cast your little spell in the magic incantation ritual box every 4 years, and a new ruler appears from the heavens and will rule over you nicely. And that is an incredibly insidious and effective form of control, because, of course, it always ends with that feel-good phrase of, oh, you are the government. The government is you. They work for you, and it's really your doing all of this stuff, like the war on Iran. That was you, because you voted for this, right? Et cetera, et cetera. It puts the onus of responsibility for what the ruling class is doing back on the people who are being ruled. It's the ultimate victim-blaming gaslighting operation, but it's one that people have so thoroughly internalized that they take it as the way things should be. And so it's very difficult to counteract that propaganda. My own experience with that, being a Canadian, I was born essentially socialist by default and grew up obviously on the left side of that left-right political spectrum. It wasn't until I started in my 20s really starting to question these fundamental assumptions and truths that we had been force-fed, talking about controversial things like 9/11 truth and other such things, which were verboten conversations. And in that process, as I started my podcast here in Japan and I started casting around for information on these things and talking to people and interviewing people, I started to notice a strange phenomenon. I of course, was someone who had always been on the left side of the political aisle and never had any truck with the right. But then suddenly I found all these people on the right side of the political aisle in the United States who were talking about the same things and who were interested in this. And it started to deconstruct my rigid left-right binary beliefs, that there is this left-right dichotomy that defines our political reality. And if people do read my book, Reportage, they will come across an essay on up-down politics, in which I attempt to articulate the real deconstruction of this left-right line, which we are told is the entirety of the political universe. And I think just like a one-dimensional line cannot possibly represent the 3D reality, the multivariate reality that we are experiencing, well, at the very least, we could add a second dimension to that line and make it a two-dimensional space, a graph. And in that regard, yes, you have a left and you have a right, and they do have some political meaning. But what has been completely excluded from our thinking is the up and down directions of politics. And I frame it as the up direction being those who want to consolidate and centralize more and more power in the hands of a few, the ruling oligarchy, versus the downists, the people who want to decentralize and disaggregate that power, which I would say is most of the human population, at least if they were properly informed about this situation. And in that respect, you can have upists on the left and upists on the right fighting with each other in these left-right political wars. that ultimately mean nothing because they keep driving us in the same political direction, which is towards consolidation of control. And once you put on those they live type glasses and start to see the political reality for what it is, I think you come to a better understanding of what's really happening, and thus a better understanding of what we're really doing here and who our real political enemies are. It's probably not your neighbor who happened to have voted for the different party in the recent election. It's the people who are running the parties themselves and running this entire system as a way of trying to contain any actual populist uprising.
Beautiful. I would love to know your personal belief systems, if any, and how you navigate reality when you start to dig into this stuff and you're constantly taking on just how horrific some of these people are and what some of their actions have been throughout history and even in the current state. And then looking at the current power dynamic that we're seeing unfold, who are the people that you've written about in your book that are struggling for power right now? I know you've got this technocracy view, and we're looking at the transhumanists. Like, what is it that's the nature of power right now that's driving people to do horrible things like fly to islands and have all the blackmail? Like, what is going on? If you could just start to just piece this together a little bit for people that are diving in.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And as you say, I think more and more and more people are starting to wake up to this reality of, oh, there's a real incredible problem at the top. It's the Epstein class versus the rest of humanity, essentially. How did this happen? And people are starting to question this for the first time. And people who even 5-10 years ago would have laughed at the suggestion that there was anything like an eyes wide shut type of ring operating. Now people are, oh, well, actually, eyes wide shut was kind of watering things down, wasn't it? So we have reached an interesting bypass in human history, but I think we can overcomplicate it and try to get too much into the weeds of this specific moment in time and these specific people, because I think what we are dealing with is not fundamentally different than what I think any generation in human history has dealt with. And again, we can get into the psychology of the would-be rulers of humanity who are trying to steward over the rest of us. But again, it's probably not as complicated. In some ways, it is not as complicated as we make it out to be. There has always been people with a lust for power. And what motivates that, and why are they wired that way? Is it a psychopathy or some sort of psychological reason for it? Is there some spiritual rationale behind it? At any rate, that has always existed throughout human history. And we can all look back and see the rulers of the Roman Empire, or any stage of human history. We can look back objectively and see, yes, there was clearly a ruling class that clearly believed themselves to be powerful and needed to rule over everyone else. And they wanted more power. What has been the age-old quest for empire? It's been to consolidate more and more power in the hands of the ruling few. It's the exact same thing that we're dealing with today. The only difference is that for some reason we have been effectively trained by propaganda over the past century or two of this representative democracy, and don't worry, conspiracies and horrible things amongst ruling elite used to happen in the distant past of human history, but they don't happen today. And people are starting to realize, oh, wait, no, we are not living in some weird and unique time in human history. It's the exact same things that have always taken place. The debauchery and craziness and villainy of the people at the top is pretty much the same as it has always been throughout human history, although perhaps more worrying now because it's more technologically sophisticated. And as people like, for example, as I quote in my book, Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World, was talking about back in the 1950s, 1960s, we were at the cusp of the ultimate revolution, which he posited as that point at which we have essentially a scientific dictatorship. People who have the ability to rewire us at the neurological level via pharmacological methods or a direct electrical stimulus or other ways of getting essentially people to, as he said, love their servitude. And we are at that point where the technological side of the tyranny is becoming very worrisome, because my fundamental viewpoint has always been that as long as the spark of the human spirit exists, as long as we have that whatever that is, that God-given impulse towards human freedom, as long as that exists in the human soul, we will be able to conquer, or at least resist, tyranny. Tyranny will come, and it may reign and steward over humanity for some period of time, but it will always fall under its own weight, unless and until that human spark is eliminated. And when we start talking about the genetic upgrades and transhumanist brain chips and other such ways of truly changing what we are at the genetic level, I think we are talking about the potential elimination of that human spark.
Yeah, incredible. I would love to hear how you navigate censorship over the years, and then start to talk a little bit about the upper echelon of power, this pyramid, and to name a few, like the Rothschilds. You always hear these names, the Bilderbergs, and the WEF is where they all meet. And could you just go down and sort of break down just some of the general approach to this pyramid? Like, who is Elon Musk in this pyramid? Who is Klaus Schwab? Who is Bill Gates? I know you did a little mini documentary on him, but a lot of people are just starting to question these people because of the Epstein files, but you've been digging into this for decades.
Yes, it's an old adage of the conspiracy realism community that if you know these people's names, chances are they are probably not at the top of the power pyramid. And I think that's probably true to some extent. I certainly don't think that a Bill Gates or an Elon Musk is truly powerful in the sense that they can set whatever agenda they want and act with impunity. No, as for example, just as one example from recent times, you mentioned Klaus Schwab, who, of course, was the director, the founder of the World Economic Forum, and who not only founded that organization, but ruled over it for 5 decades and shaped it into what it became. And we all saw how he was very unceremoniously thrown under the bus last year with an internal WEF investigation into his shenanigans and his dirty dealings. And he was using WEF money for hotel rooms and whatever, all that kind of stuff. He was just thrown us to the side. And who was appointed in his place? Well, Larry Fink, of course, the founder of BlackRock, who is an increasingly important financial person, and a Norwegian politician who actually just went down and had to resign from WF in disgrace because he turned out to be a friend of Epstein. Wow, who could have guessed? So I think that points towards something, which is that, yes, there are these people who are definitely wheeler and dealers and who have a lot of, who act as hubs for spokes to a lot of different agendas and connect a lot of things and certainly have their snoot in a lot of pies. But it doesn't mean that they are the top of the power pyramid and they control everything. And so if you're asking, what is the real capstone of the pyramid? Who is sitting at the head of this table of power? I have a couple of responses to that. One is which, of course, I'm not at that level of power, so I don't know. And is there, again, any name that we could throw out, one could plausibly argue that they are not the actual top of that pyramid. But secondly, I often tend to say that our obsession with trying to name the person or the group that is at the top of this and stewarding over everything implies that there is a monolithic conspiracy, which I think is kind of the cartoon version of conspiracy, because I think that is, of course, the easily dismissible, oh, they all just meet in one big smoky room and everybody gets their marching orders from the head of this, this organization, and everybody just reads a script. I don't think it's as cartoonishly simple as that. I don't believe that Putin and Xi and Trump and Netanyahu and everyone is just getting a script that they're just reading and playing their part in all of this. No, I think these are real human beings who have their own place in this agenda, and they come together. And that's why I think it's precisely at those points where a number of different players at this table, their agendas coincide. That's where we start to see these eruptions of events. That's why a JFK assassination or a 9/11 can be pulled off, is because it doesn't serve one particular person or one particular group. It serves a number of different interests. So there are a number of players at the table who will combine to use their power and their might to suppress information or to direct an investigation or to make an event happen or what have you. So that's my understanding of this. I think people get too obsessed with the eye at the top of the pyramid, who is the singular person. And the other thing that does is it not only provides us with what I think is probably an inaccurate map of reality, it also gets us to spend all of our time obsessing and fighting with each other generally over who is, no, it's this group, no, it's this person, no, it's that person who's at the top. instead of doing something productive, like saying, okay, there is some sort of pyramid of power. There is some sort of control grid that exists. And yes, there are layers that I think are above the layers that we see. Of course, the politicians might be at the lower level of that power pyramid. And there are people above them, and there are people above them, and maybe there's somebody above all of those people that we don't even know. But squabbling over the exact nature of that hierarchy seems to me to be less productive than to say, all I know is that the vast mass of humanity, the 99.9% of humanity, is supporting this entire pyramid with our time, our labor, our energy, our resources. What we do on a day-to-day basis is essentially supporting this entire pyramid of power. Why don't we withdraw to the extent that it's possible, not even all at once, but just a little bit, withdraw that time, attention, energy, and resources, and start creating what we want to bring into the world? And I think that would be 1,000 times more productive than arguing, squabbling about the exact nature of who is at the top of whatever, power pyramid may or may not exist. So that's my broad take on it, but I'm happy to answer specific questions on it.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I feel like what they're doing now with technology and algorithms is creating a version of a simulation where all people are getting is sound bites, clickbait, titles, and we're all being somewhat put under hypnosis, if you will, as a species through screens, which is the Brave New World, the Soma effect. And I feel like one of the best things that people could do right now is to pull back from screen time, even though that's what we're doing here and that's how you share information, and it can be an incredible superpower. But I've even noticed for myself, the weirder it gets and the more ramped up it's getting, I do better when I'm up on top of the mountaintop and I'm, riding my bike in the sunshine and I'm free from it for at least hours and hours at a time. And that gives us that space where you have access to whatever that is, where you have to contemplate and you have a contemplative practice. It doesn't have to be staring at your navel all day. It can just be you alone with your own psyche. And I feel like that's actually the main weapon of mass distraction right now. And I think you probably agree. Is that right?
That is correct. And if people want more on that, this isn't just woo-woo or vibes or, feel-good philosophy. There is genuine, actual hard science behind this that I hope people will look into. And I did a multi-part documentary called The Media Matrix, where I was looking at the history and development of mass media and how it has been used as a weapon of propaganda and control and placating the masses. And very specifically, when it comes to that idea of screens and how they can hypnotize you, literally. I was citing the research of Herbert Krugman in that documentary, and he was he would become the manager of public opinion research at General Electric in the 1970s. But in 1969, he was conducting research on people watching TV, and he would hook them up to an electrode, which was doing a brain scan of them on a Grass Model 7 polygraph, which in turn interfaced with a Honeywell 7600 computer and a Cat 400B computer. So you can go and look at that experiment. But what he found was he turned on the TV and began monitoring the brain waves of his subject. And he found through repeated testing that within about 30 seconds, the brain waves switched from predominantly beta waves, indicating alert and conscious attention, to predominantly alpha waves, indicating an unfocused, receptive lack of attention, the state of aimless fantasy and daydreaming below the threshold of consciousness. So within 30 seconds, these subjects staring at that TV screen were being put into something like a sort of, if not quite a trance, at least a dreamlike state that was bypassing their conscious critical thinking faculties. And this wasn't just one experiment conducted by one researcher one time. It has been multiply tested and verified by multiple researchers over the decades. And that's just about the TV. But now, of course, everybody has a screen in front of their face almost all the time. You and me, no exception, right at this moment. And whoever is listening or watching this conversation, no exception right at this moment. So the idea that we are steeped in this sort of media matrix that it shapes and controls so much of our perception is something that is so obvious that I think people don't even notice it anymore. It's like asking a fish to be aware of the water that they're swimming in. No, of course, we're just staring at screens all day, listening to voices of people that we've never been in the same room with and presumably never will, and getting all our information that way. What could go wrong? Oh, well, a lot of things could go wrong, especially as we saw at the end of the 20th century with the consolidation of so much media control in the hands of a few corporations, obviously there were corporate gatekeepers with a vested interest, financial, if not otherwise, but financial certainly, in keeping certain information from people or getting people to focus on certain things and not focus on other things. And now we've lived through this incredible decentralization of the media that's taken place through the online media revolution that I'm obviously very keenly aware of because it's defined my life. I have a career because this online media revolution took place. But obviously, there are interests that are seeking to control it. And in that Media Matrix documentary, I point out the various times that this flowering of information has taken place, from the original Gutenberg printing press and the flowering of information that came with that. And of course, the ways that ruling oligarchs of the time tried to clamp down on that innovation. And we saw, for example, in the 17th century, there were in England, there were the various licensing laws. If you were going to run a printing press, you had to have a license from the government, etc. So there have been various attempts, ham-handed attempts to try to suppress information. But the most insidious, the most effective way to censor information was not through literal writing of laws and trying to enforce them at the point of a gun. It is through the consolidation of control, corporatizing the media space and making it into a business structure that you and I would have no access to these big, complicated printing presses or radio stations or satellite equipment, etc., that's needed to run a modern media empire. But again, internet put everything in the palms of everyone's hands. Everyone can suddenly, be a journalist and go out and take videos and interview and whatever, do whatever they like. So how do they consolidate that? Well, one of the ways is by getting everybody to start congregating on a few select corporate big tech websites. So now everybody goes to YouTube and they go to Facebook and they go to Instagram and they go to Twitter. There are a few websites that are essentially define most people's day-to-day internet experience at this point. And we all know what could go wrong with that. And I know it very specifically because back a few years ago, my YouTube channel, over 500,000 subscribers, was taken offline like that, flip of a switch. Because, of course, I was spreading thought crime around what was happening with COVID. And interestingly enough, last year, I appealed that ruling. And because the political winds had shifted and public opinion had shifted on the issues, suddenly YouTube decided, oh, you know what? Actually, it turns out you didn't violate our community guidelines. Here's your channel back. But that just goes to show the fickle nature of this type of censorship that can exist online. And even beyond that, what I'm afraid of even more than the outright censorship, which, as we see, can be done with a flick of a digital switch. But what about the algorithmic censorship? Because that is really that's more insidious because we don't see it, we don't feel it, you can't prove it unless you can actually get into the guts of these algorithms and start and showing how things are being suppressed or limited. But we know it is happening. We know that Twitter and YouTube and all of these companies are deciding what videos and what podcasts and what things to put in front of you and what not to put in front of you. And we know that 99.99999% of people, 99.9999% of the time, are not sitting there consciously searching for something. No, they're letting the algorithm dictate what they see and what they hear. So there are incredibly powerful technologies now for shaping our entire view of the world without us even knowing that is taking place. And if people want a very palpable and vivid and I think bone-chillingly scary example of that vision, they can go to Google's own internal documents. There was a video that came out about a decade ago called The Selfish Ledger, and it was produced internally by Google for Google, talking about how these types of algorithms can be used to shape not just individuals and their lives, although obviously that you can steer someone in a number of different ways and directions to basically shape their life and alter their lifestyle. But they talked about how ultimately, of course, that done not just to one individual, but to billions of people over not just years, but decades or centuries will eventually literally start to shape the human species itself. You will literally have control over the human genome, the selfish ledger that they're talking about. It's this incredibly fascinating peek into the way that these people are thinking about this. And I think it is the accurate way to think about it. We are being shaped right now by things that we can but dimly understand or see. And I'm aware I'm no exception to that, because I'm here talking to you because I, back in 2006, started falling down a YouTube rabbit hole and seeing all these videos from these conspiracy theorists, with all this weird information that ultimately I started researching for myself and finding, there is some truth to that. Oh, I didn't know about that. I didn't know about that. And that literally shaped the rest of my life. I'm sitting here talking to you because of that. So I know how powerful that type of information shaping can be. And it's happening on a daily basis in ways that we don't even see or understand.
Yeah, I would love to hear what your biggest aha moment was. Was it 9/11? What was the big one that was like, holy shit, I never would have thought? Was there a big moment when you really woke up to some of this stuff?
I do. Again, I do talk about this in my book, in my first essay, where I talk about the falling down the rabbit hole there in 2006. And there was definitely, I think, the first subject that was really the one that started me along this path was definitely 9/11 truth, which obviously in 2006 was a very, very big issue. And certainly having a fundamental question about what happened on 9/11 in 2006 completely reshaped one's political universe, because suddenly the war on terror became a very, very different thing. And again, it just completely reshaped my perception of the world once I started to question those events. So that was the first thing that got me along this path. And there were a number of things that, again, I talk about. For example, the Adam Curtis documentaries, Power of Nightmares, or The Century of the Self. Things like this that were, again, extremely informative and, again, started to question some of my fundamental assumptions. But I remember that the penny drop moment, to the extent that there was a penny drop moment, or at least the moment that sort of solidified, this isn't just some like 9/11 truth, is just this thing. And, this thing happened and there was this conspiracy, but whatever, everything else is pretty much no, the thing that got me to realize that the entire, there's a systematic way in which we've been manipulated, was when I saw the Money Masters documentary. And I started to question, okay, so what is money, and where does it come from in our system, and how did that originate, and what is a central bank, and how does that operate, and what does that mean for the ability to shape civilization itself? Once I started to question that layer of the propaganda matrix is when I essentially started to, I would say that's my real waking up moment.
Yeah. And do you still stick to that, follow the money as the best way to seek truth in our landscape right now? Is that usually one of the quickest ways to find out what's going on?
I would say it's a pretty good way to at least start in on a subject. Maybe it doesn't explain everything, but it's always, I think, in our current system, in our current era, it's always at least the simplest way to understand any given event. Because there are a number of different methods of control, and there are a number of different things that motivate people for that lust for power that we were talking about earlier. But the one thing that guarantees to bring a number of different players to the table to agree on some sort of agenda is money. And if you can create that money out of thin air, essentially, and direct it towards this or starve it away from that, then you can truly shape human civilization.
Yeah. And I know that you have like limited attention and time like every human being, but you're constantly putting out new data, new information. What is it right now that's very intriguing to you and you want to spit it out, but maybe you just haven't had the time, the energy, the money, the resources? What is it that if you had a team of people, unlimited money, what would you be wanting to share most right now about the nature of things?
Well, I think unfortunately, I see all too vividly that we are hurtling towards a World War III type scenario right now. And that lines up in a number of different ways. And of course, I don't mean it in the way that I think that would be talked about by sort of average geopolitical commentators who genuinely, I think, probably do believe that there really are nation state actors. And this is a two-dimensional nation state sort of risk game that's taking place. I, of course, bring in a third dimension to the geopolitical idea and think that there is a sort of grander scheme of manipulation that is not nation state dependent. But having said that, I do think that we are being engineered into a sort of World War III conflict, which unfortunately, there's an infamous hopefully at least amongst my audience, an infamous statement that was made by a researcher for something called the Reese Committee back in the 1950s. It was a U.S. congressional committee that was looking into tax-exempt foundations like the Ford Foundation and the Rockefellers and the Carnegies, etc., and looking into their tax-exempt status and what they were really doing in American society, etc. And this researcher named Norman Dodd gave an extensive interview back in the 1980s. I think he gave a couple of different interviews, but the one I'm thinking of specifically, he talked about gaining access to the meeting minutes of the Carnegie Endowment from its inception. And the first few years in the late 1908, 9, 10, heading into 1911, 12, 13, reading through those minutes and seeing the board of the endowment arguing in a most scholarly and learned fashion about, is there any way that is more effective to change society than war? And after a year of such scholarly and learned debate, they decided, no, there is not. There's no better method than war to change society. So then the question that they started to debate became, how can we thus get America into war? And as he's talking about, this is 1910, 1911, something in that time frame, that was the furthest thing from the mind of the average American at the time. But lo and behold, of course, we see the eventuation of World War I. And even despite it being an incredibly unpopular idea in 1914, 15 into 16, that the U.S. would even think about being involved in that war. Well, and Wilson, of course, even campaigned on keeping America out of war, but then, of course, rescinded on that and ultimately brought America into war. And of course, that had the exact type of world, or at least society changing effect that the Carnegie Endowment had been talking about. And we saw a number of different changes in American society, Canadian society, societies around the world. Obviously, war completely changed the social contract, as it were, for a number of different polities. And of course, infamously, for example, as a Canadian, I can say the income tax was a temporary measure that was instituted in, I believe, 1917 as part of the war effort. It's only for World War I, guys. Don't worry. And of course, obviously, the income tax never went away. It's because that was the excuse to institute a new ruling class contract with the lower classes, essentially. And from that, we see, of course, the creation of the Federal Reserve and the expansion of its powers, et cetera, et cetera. So that is the way that I see these types of wars, what they're really about. Generally, it's not about the scramble for resources on the fixed pie of the world between competing nation states. There is some aspect of that, but I think that more fundamentally, it is about changing the ability of a ruling class to consolidate power. And after World War I, we saw the formation of the League of Nations. After World War II, we saw the formation of the United Nations. After World War III, we will see ... fill in the blanks. I think we understand the nature of these types of events and the way they completely rewrite the rules of the game. So having said that, I do see us hurtling towards a World War III type scenario. And that's why, personally, I think if I had infinite resources and infinite time, I would be devoting all of my time towards a documentary project that I started in 2018, on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. It was called the World War I Conspiracy. And obviously, I hope it's obvious to people, that World War I conspiracy documentary ended with a to be continued ... And I have been working on the follow-up for a number of years now, and I really need to finish that because obviously I think it's important. There will be a World War II conspiracy, and of course, there will be a World War III conspiracy. And I think once those pieces are put together, that is certainly the most important information that I think I could be conveying at this time.
God, I would love to watch that, make it like a series. I'm sure there's got to be tons of hours packed into that. And the same thing with the war on drugs, the war on terror, the war on viruses. There's always this idea that there's this thing, we need all these resources, and now we need to keep everybody safe. Can you talk a little bit about the war on viruses that we just had, this COVID scenario, and what was actually playing out and why they did that? Some of the basic fundamentals that most people are just now starting to be curious about, if you don't mind.
Yes. Well, for people who don't know, I have been talking about medical martial law and various health grabs, power grabs by the World Health Organization and affiliated institutions for, well, at least since 2009, documentarily. I had a podcast on medical martial law, talking about the ways that the the legal and political infrastructure for a biosecurity state essentially was being laid at least since 2001. And people might not remember anymore, but yes, 2001 not only saw, of course, 9/11, but then it was immediately followed up by the anthrax attacks. And there's a lot to say about the anthrax attack and what happened there and who was behind that. But long story short, of course, that event was preceded by something called Dark Winter, which was this simulation crisis scenario of, well, what if these terrorists had some smallpox and they were releasing it in America, et cetera. And it was, of course, all related to essentially getting various vaccines, including the anthrax vaccine, through the U.S. military system and into the arms of first soldiers, and eventually, of course, the general population. But from that point, and from the anthrax attack specifically, we started to get for example, the passage of the Model State Health Emergency Powers Act. I can't remember the exact epithet that's used, but essentially there was this model legislation that was created and then forwarded and passed in state legislature after state legislature all around the U.S. to institute powers for the governor to declare emergency medical situations in which quarantines and forced vaccinations, etc., would be legally on the table. Also, around that same time, we saw the furthering and then the passing of the international health regulations at the World Health Organization, which gave the WHO the statutory power to declare a public health emergency of international concern. And when that is declared, suddenly essentially the Director General of the WHO has this authority to send countries into, if not into lockdown, that was not what was specifically said in the IHR, but at any rate, public health guidelines could be issued by the World Health Organization, and member states would be expected to comply with those guidelines in various ways. It also set up the infrastructure for the buying of emergency vaccines, etc. And that PHEIC, the Public Health Emergency of International Concern, that was tested out a few times in the intervening years. The swine flu hype of 2009, does anyone remember that? I do remember that, because here in Japan, when I was teaching in the public school system here, I remember schools being shut down because one child had the sniffles. So, oh my God, it's swine flu, let's shut down the school, etc. So there was that incident. There was the Zika incident. There was an Ebola incident in the 20-teens that, again, was an excuse for this. But it was 2020, of course, where they really pulled the trigger on this and instituted the scamdemic, as I call it. And despite having known about this and talked about it, warned about it, and thought about it for a number of years, it wasn't until a few months, or at least a couple of months into the scamdemic itself, that I read a very short essay that really crystallized what was happening to me. And it was by an Italian philosopher / lecturer in jurisprudence called Giorgio Agamben. And he wrote a very short piece that put the name, the exact word that I was looking for. It was biosecurity. And in that word, he was able to encapsulate what was happening. The idea that politics and health were being merged into this singular thing, and that now our civic duty was to not participate in the world, not to go out, to lock ourselves in our own home under the guise of this biosecurity state. And that, to me, crystallized what was going on. Of course, this really, truly had nothing to do with public health, as we now know, of course, and as anyone with their head screwed on straight at the time could demonstrably see with their own eyes. What we were dealing with was not the bubonic plague 2.0 that was going to wipe out 50% of the human population. We were looking at something that, even to the extent that whatever existed and was spreading, certainly was not deadly to the average person who did not have multiple comorbidities and was not obese and over 70 years old, et cetera, et cetera. We know the various factors that suddenly led people to die, but and it was, of course, exacerbated by the lockdowns, et cetera. Again, we know that story. It was not about public health. So what was it about? It was about the institution of biosecurity measures, the flexing of those biosecurity muscles, and as was talked about in a Milken Institute hosted conversation in October 2019. So the very time at which we are told that whatever was spreading in Wuhan was beginning to spread, there was a conversation that featured people like Anthony Fauci. There was a Dr. Bright, and other members of the U.S. medical health establishment, the biosecurity establishment, talking about the development of a universal flu vaccine and how all of these incredible new technologies, mRNA, DNA vaccines, were starting to at any rate, they were feasible now. But barring some sort of event, it was going to take at least 10 years and probably billions and billions of dollars in research and development and testing in order to get these approved through the approval process. And they specifically said, unless there was some sort of major flu event or something that allowed the U.S. government to step in and use emergency measures to approve these types of new radical medical interventions. And lo and behold, just a few months later, exactly what happened. And hopefully by now people know about Event 201 that again was taking place in October of 2019, where they were simulating a worldwide spreading coronavirus pandemic and what the response to that could and would and should be, and how vaccines were going to be important, etc. Again, hopefully people know about all of this by now. But again, what do we do with this information? I think it was about the cementing in of the biosecurity state, which is a convenient way for the switch over to the digital. I'm struggling for another way of saying this, but essentially biosecurity complex, which is going to be comprised of digital IDs, which will have to be presented in order to allow participation in the public space, etc. Just the habituation of people into scanning QR codes or checking, vaccine registration in order to be allowed into certain public places was part of the indoctrination towards this digital ID system that is clearly the new ruling paradigm if the would-be rulers of humanity get their way. So this is a very vast, big system, a big idea. But again, like so many other things, as I said, World War I, changing the mindset of the American public and people around the world. Again, the war on virus changed the mindset of a lot of people and instituted new habits and new ideas and new ways of thinking about what is possible, at least in the emergency times. And, oh, by the way, maybe some of those things will hang around even when we're not in a declared emergency.
Right. And who do you think RFK is? And do you think the COVID mRNA technology was at some level a bioweapon to some degree? Do you think of the SV40 and you're seeing all these all-cause mortalities going up? Do you think that was an intentional, harmful thing? What is your perspective on both of those folks and those two situations?
Yes. So with regards to RFK, I would like to think that he is sincere, at least about his health intentions. But having said that, obviously, I am not a fan of any particular politician or political figure. And I think that the idea of Make America Healthy Again is a great idea. I'm 100% on board with that. Who wouldn't be? What normal, rational, average human being wouldn't be interested in making people healthier again, generally speaking, and doing so by removing food colorings and dyes and toxic chemicals from the food supply and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm on board with that. But obviously, there have been a lot of questionable things coming out of this Trump administration on regard to that. People, of course, remember a few months ago when RFK was talking about wearables and trackables and how they were going to be part of the MAHA movement. And there was a lot of pushback against that. Obviously, we've just seen the new ruling about glyphosate and declaring it to be a strategic national defense asset that has to be protected against legal immunity for the glyphosate manufacturers, et cetera. And now RFK is coming out and saying he disagrees with it, but he understands the position, et cetera. So again, even if he is sincere, he is still compromised because he's part of the political process. So do not put your hopes in any particular political savior. But making America healthy again is a good thing. With regards to the vaccines as bioweapon, it's difficult to understand what they are other than part of the ongoing, I think, never-ending depopulation agenda, which is to make us sickly and dependent on big pharma for various, more medical interventions, essentially. It certainly was not about health, and it was not about fixing our health. If people go to my Bill Gates documentary that you alluded to earlier, it's called Who is Bill Gates? It was a 4-part documentary that I put out in June of 2020. I talk about the vaccine agenda in that and how really the vaccine agenda is one of those hubs that has a number of spokes that tie into a number of different parts of this agenda. For example, there's baffling things that didn't seem to make sense at first. Like, for example, there's this vaccine group that's talking about how the most important thing is to get digital IDs for babies so that we can track their vaccination status, of course. And so we need to get every baby in India or in the developing world, or eventually in the world generally, on these digital ID systems because, it'll help us track their vaccination status. So it starts to nexus in with the digital ID agenda. But then, of course, we also have the cashless agenda. That's another spoke off of that. And once you have the digital ID, then you can tie people's social security into that, so that the government will have a nexus point that they'll understand. And you've gotten your booster, so you can have your monthly stipend, et cetera, et cetera. It starts to obviously coalesce an entire agenda. So vaccines are about control, especially when they become mandated, or at least necessary prerequisites for participation in daily life. And that's why I see a potential danger. We are hearing more and more about how universal basic income is going to be necessary in the future because everyone's going to be losing their jobs because of all this automation. What will be the answer? UBI. But you understand, of course, that UBI will obviously come with strings attached. And when they decide that you will have to take your mandated medical intervention in order to be eligible for your UBI status, most people are going to roll up their sleeves most of the time and take whatever is given to them. So that's part of the agenda that's going on right now. So even if it wasn't a direct bioweapon, and I believe it is, the turbo cancers and other things that we're seeing as a result of it, the myocarditis, etc., even if it wasn't for that, I think indirectly it's also a form of weapon because it puts people in the crosshairs of this digital panopticon.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm on board with all of that for sure. What is your perspective right now on geoengineering, cloud seeding, and how it's being used?
Yeah, the thing that always baffles me the most about this issue is that every single time I ever see it reported in the establishment media, it is always reported as some sort of completely new thing that you've never heard of before, guys. But did you know they can seed clouds? And look, here's an example of how they do that. And of course, as I imagine most people know, I certainly know it. And I don't even mean from like conspiracy reality research. I mean just from general being alive for the past nearly half a century. I've seen it throughout my life. Yeah, of course, cloud seeding has existed since the 1940s at least, right? I mean, it's been going on a long time. This is not new technology. Why is it always presented as something new and amazing? And I think, of course, that is part of the propaganda to introduce the public gradually to the concept of the geoengineering and the weather modification that's already taking place. And then eventually, of course, as these types of propaganda campaigns roll out, it's always a variant of that thing those crazy conspiracy theorists are talking about. That doesn't exist. It's not happening. They're crazy. Let's laugh at them. Oh, they're crazy. They're stupid. They're crazy. They're stupid. Until, okay, so there is this thing and it does exist and they're trying it and they're thinking about, but okay. And then eventually it becomes, yes, it exists and it's real and it's good. And why would you be against it, you crazy person? So that's generally the narrative arc of these propaganda campaigns. And I think that is what's happening with the geoengineering. And we're about in the middle of that, where they're starting to transition away from that's the craziest thing I've ever heard to, yes, of course it's possible. And why aren't we? We should be thinking about it because obviously there's so many climate problems that could be solved with this marvelous new technology. I'd like to think that the public isn't going to believe that when they make the switch, but unfortunately we've seen the public has gone along with a lot of crazy ideas in the past. So we'll see. We'll see if they've been hopefully inoculated, to use that phrase, against this type of propaganda rollout from the inoculations that they were given a few years ago, and how the narrative on that changed. Maybe people are starting to question some of the pronouncements from the so-called establishment authorities. But I'll point people to a speech that the director of the CIA made a decade ago at this point, talking about weather modification and geoengineering, and et cetera, et cetera. This is not crazy, out there, outlandish conspiracy theory. The technology exists, and I think it's being used a lot more than is being publicly admitted. But at any rate, they even admit that it exists and that they are certainly trying it, thinking about it, testing it, et cetera. So it's only a matter of time until they reveal, oh, yes, we've been doing it for decades now.
Right. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Where would you hedge your bets right now financially? Where would you think that people could stick their money that could be possibly safe, if it could be at all, during this transfer of wealth that's happening, this digital currency? What is Bitcoin to you?
Bitcoin is a good idea that should have been tried, I would say. So for people who don't understand, cryptocurrency in its modern form stems from the 2009 Bitcoin white paper that was by Satoshi Nakamoto, whoever that was. And it solved a number of interesting mathematical problems, essentially, about how you secure a decentralized ledger. It's easy to secure a centralized ledger where there is a single authority who approves or disapproves each transaction and can record it in a single reliable way. But how do you do that when you have a decentralized ledger spread out over the world? That is a very tricky problem that was solved in a very unique and interesting way in that white paper. And as a result of that, of course, we saw the launching of Bitcoin and a million other coins. Okay, interesting. But the way that that invention and that idea, that realization was sold initially to the public was, hey, this is a way to, it's no coincidence it came out in 2009 directly after the worldwide financial meltdown of 2008. And obviously people very, very waking up to the monetary question itself and these central banks and how they operate and where the money is coming from and where it's going and how it's being manipulated. Suddenly you have stadiums full of people cheering "End the Fed" along with Ron Paul. I mean, it was an interesting time, obviously, a potentially very revolutionary time. And in that time frame, this revolutionary technology comes out and it says, hey, we're going to disintermediate. We don't need central banks. We have this system. It's going to produce 21 million Bitcoin and only 21 million Bitcoin. It is algorithmically limited. So no one will be able to inflate the supply and create more when they need to go wage war in Iran or whatever the case may be. And people will be able to trade it directly. There will be no middleman that can come in and stop them, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea was this idea of complete freedom and disintermediation, getting out of that system, exactly what I was talking about before of, hey, we're supporting this power pyramid with our participation in it. How can we withdraw and create something else? Well, monetarily withdrawing and being able to transact with each other in ways that have nothing to do with the banking system sounds like, it sounds exactly what we're looking for, doesn't it? But unfortunately, of course, an idea like that cannot be allowed to come to fruition in that way. And as a result, there were always dark forces from its very inception that were trying to steer it in a very different direction. And we now know, thanks to the work of researchers like Aaron Day, for example, I just talked to him about the hijacking of Bitcoin by, drumroll please, of course, Jeffrey Epstein. Epstein was there with funding for various key players in essentially the steering of Bitcoin away from that vision of decentralized, disintermediated, peer-to-peer cash, which was the original idea, towards, it's a store of value that you should never actually use, and it should just sit there, and it will create wealth for you in dollars, because that's what our real aim is. And of course, in order to do that, you'll have to go through these regulated exchanges where you'll have to give your blood and DNA and next of kin and everything else in order to be and fill in all of your tax forms properly. That's the way we should do this. And we should tokenize all of it and put it in these Cantor Fitzgerald and other types of traditional Wall Street financial institutions should be the ones stewarding over all of this, which is the point that we're at now with obviously the stablecoin idea and the Genius Act and all of that. Again, people can see my recent Aaron Day interview about his article for more information on that. But yeah, I think Bitcoin was a good idea. And there are still people who are trying to make some sort of cryptocurrency in that sense happen. But it seems decreasingly likely that we're going to achieve any sort of real freedom from that. However, having said that, it's always been my position that I'm not an all eggs in one basket kind of person when it comes to the monetary issue. I think different types of transactions might call for different ways of transacting. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I don't think that gold and only gold is the only thing that anyone should ever use at all times. No, there are certain transactions where it might make sense to transact in a precious metal. There are certain transactions where it might make sense to work with an actual digital currency, like a decentralized cryptocurrency. There are certain transactions where plain old cash would do the trick, et cetera, et cetera. community currencies, let's systems, and time banks, and other such ideas. I'm yes, all of the above and more. And certainly for people who have their dogma on certain issues, I would be happy to transact with them in their currency of choice for certain situations, and then I would transact in something else in other situations. I think it's our sort of the dogmatic approach that people get into on the monetary issue that limits their ability to really interact with people on the full spectrum of different interactions that can happen. And now, especially as someone living in Japan, whose most of my audience is overseas in some way, yeah, it's difficult for, okay, guys, you can only subscribe to my report in gold, so please send me gold through the mail or something. No, that would be ridiculous. That obviously wouldn't work. So we need a lot of different ideas. So I'm not dogmatic on it. Having said that, if I was in precious metals right now, I would just observe that, yes, it has been historically true that silver was the people's metal and gold was the banker's metal. And although obviously gold, store of value, sure, I understand that concept, and it's absolutely true. An ounce of gold back 2,000 years ago would have bought you a well-tailored outfit, and at this point, an ounce of gold will buy you a well-tailored suit. Certainly, yeah, it retains its value, but it is not necessarily the best medium of exchange for day-to-day transactions. And silver, obviously, is not only a useful metal industrially, but of course also monetarily, and has been used as that for a long time. And I'll just throw in parenthetically, for people who don't know about the history of bimetallism and that movement, there's a lot to look into with William Jennings Bryan and the Cross of Gold speech and all of that. There's just this incredibly important monetary history that's been completely excluded from our education since, that's old fuddy-duddy stuff, whatever. We've got the almighty US dollar now from the Federal Reserve in Federal Reserve we trust. And who needs to think about this monetary issue? So anyway, I'll just leave it there for this point.
Yeah. You are a wealth of knowledge. I wish I could keep talking to you. I have you for the hour now, but I want people to go and discover your work. I'll put all of it in the show notes, but I always ask everybody, if you were going to die today, what would you want to share with the world? And let's with you, because you've put so much content out. Act like your website doesn't exist. Your podcast never existed. You have this one brief moment to share something important with the world.
I will just go back to what I was saying earlier. I think as long as the human spirit exists, there is a chance, and there is genuine hope. And I don't mean hopium, which I've talked about before, which is the political substitute for hope, where there's some kind of political messiah that's going to come and save us all if you vote harder next time. No, I mean genuine hope, which we do need as human beings. We need something that will propel us forward, give us something to work towards. We can achieve incredible things as long as that human spirit exists. So my most important message is to retain your humanity in whatever way you can. And that it might seem trivial at first, as just refusing the digital ID or whatever the case may be. But I think those types of actions will be the things that either decide human fate one way or another. Either we go along with this system as it is developing and we lose our humanity, or we fight to retain it. And we maintain that ability to at least have the hope that humanity will thrive in the future. So that's the most profound and important message is, I would say, resist the beast and do not take the brain chip. Retain your humanity in whatever way you can. Your cognitive sovereignty is the ultimate thing that they want to take away from you. And if you let them, then we will end up like Winston Smith at the end of 1984, learning to love Big Brother.
Man, I love it. You are fascinating. I truly appreciate your time today. I'll be sure to send everybody your way. And thanks for your amazing message there at the end. That was powerful.
Thank you for having me on. Thank you for spreading this work.
Thank you for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it and subscribe to the show and rate the show. That helps people to discover it. And enjoy the next episode.
What we call reality is in fact nothing more than a culturally sanctioned and linguistically reinforced hallucination of some sort.